talk about this very new, exciting book, Islam and Anarchism, Relationships and Resonances. We had a good discussion earlier today about one of its chapters on non- and anti-authoritarian Islam. I'm really looking forward to a wider discussion today about the rest of the book. And so again, thank you so much for coming, and thank you. Join me in re-welcoming Mohamad Abdou back to Queens and Kingston. Take it away, Mohamed.
So it might be a little bit strange for me to hold the mic and walk around. So forgive me for that. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It's an honor to be with you all. Do I need to use the mic? It's just too distracting.
It might help, but it's okay. If you stay close to this, it'll pick you.
The recorder? Okay, I'll try and do that. Forgive me, because it just might be a little bit distracting for me. So, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It's an honor to be with you all here back on Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territory. There are many ways in which one can begin. Forgive me, this is a bit of a surreal experience. And for so many different reasons. Because I'm seeing people that I love, people that I haven't seen, people that have mentored me, people that have been part of my community. And I moved here in 1997, and I was about 16 years old. So, and I left in 2019. So the durée is quite extensive. The pebbles, the rocks, the limestone, the rose, the weed that grows out of the concrete pavement. I understand, I know. I feel I've walked, I've learned. So thank you very much to MSGP for bringing me. Thank you to Sayyida, to Adnan, to so many of the people that contributed to organizing this event and many other events. I was in Montreal yesterday, and inshallah I'll be in Ottawa tomorrow, and then Toronto on Friday. I'm a postdoc at Cornell, and Cornell is one of the largest land grab universities, or if not the largest land grab university in all of Turtle Island. It is engaged in a land grab of over 990,000 acres of indigenous land. 250 tribes were displaced, nations. Okay. Its territory stretches, that Cornell owns, all the way from New York to Wisconsin, all the way to California. And this was facilitated by acts like the Morale Act that the US government had passed. This too is unceded land and territory. And it is impossible for me to begin to talk about this book, the journey of which is 15 years, because it's actually based on an MA thesis that I wrote in 2007, and there were even incarnations of it before that. And it took 15 years, and the journey is very extensive, and many things happened in between. There's much that I wanted to incorporate, particularly after my PhD that I did under the supervision of Adnan, on the topic of Islam and queer Muslims and feminist Muslims, but particularly queer Nubian and Sudanese Egyptians in the context of Egypt, trans sex workers, queer men in the military, as well as queer Muslims over here, because I wanted to understand what is going on with this thing called queerness, and how do folks that identify or disidentify even with it as Muslims understand and reinterpret, if at all, their own interpretation of Islam. I learned a lot from my participants. It was also historical archival. I dealt with 2 case studies. And after I was finished, it was time to go back to this original project. Then I was really suffering a great deal as a consequence of the fact that it wasn't published yet. It went through actually 3 publishers, and they were all interested, up until I landed with Pluto, because I felt that it was the best form, particularly insofar as a social movement publisher, and one that is dedicated to a certain radical politics. I'm a scholar activist, but I don't see that loosely, because who and what is an activist if we are active and activated every single day? I don't believe in apolitical nihilism. Nietzsche wasn't an apolitical nihilist. If he was a nihilist, then he would be writing all the patterns of the patterns on butterfly wings, and even then that would be nihilism. So we're mobilized, whether we're sitting in front of Netflix trying to get a bit of respite and relief from the trauma, the intergenerational hurt and pain, particularly as Black, Indigenous, as people of color folks. We've been worn into war before we even came to realize or recognize our situating within that war. And particularly I'm talking with regards to racialized folks. We learn to fetishize white skin, to bleach our own skin white, straighten our hair, and internalize even worse than all that, cultures of whiteness. What do I mean by cultures of whiteness? Nation-state discourses, politics of assimilation, capitalist ethics, development, freedom, civilization, and our appeal to all these terms and terminologies. The barometer that the white man had set. Alhamdulillah, I had the opportunity to really live a remarkable life. I don't know what I did to deserve to be involved in the post-Seattle anti-globalization movements, 1999, anti-Iraq war, anti-Afghanistan war, protests, to have the opportunity to live with the Zapatistas, one of the most renowned, if not the most renowned social movement on the face of the planet. They declared war against the Mexican state, their indigenous movement in 1994, went and set up their own universe and their own world, their own reality. They reconnected with the land. They rediscovered it and understood their own cultures and their traditions. They established their own women's revolutionary laws. And they divested from the current dominant order of the world, as in capitalist nation states. And there isn't a single nation state on earth that does not have capitalist dimensions within it. And there's only one market, and it's the integrated worldwide capitalist market, regardless of where we are. Of course, that includes China and Russia and a lot of the global south, even within Latin America. Tahrir and my involvement in 2011, which I've been open and quite frank with regards to. And of course, 2013 and what happened insofar as the removal of the Muslim Brotherhood, and which I have my own opinions with respect to. The Mohawks in Tantanega, and so on and so forth. So, alhamdulillah, the social movement organizing and activism is something that is central to how I identify, who I see myself is, the kind of politics that I espouse, the communities and the people that I connect to, and try and strive to build relationship with, and that affected this book. These are very troubling times, and I've been asked repeatedly, how did this book come about? And like I said, it's a very long-winded story. But my reply of late has been because of the politics of translation and mistranslation. I'm dealing with language, and I'm dealing with power, and I'm dealing with the material elements of the relationship between land and power and land. Land insofar as how it defines our masculinities, our femininities, what we perceive as a zahir, what is on surface, what is in depth, the private, the public, al-khususiyat, al-umumiyat, and so on and so forth. Land is everything. Gives autonomy, gives sustenance. Without land, where would we be? And yet, look at what we have done with land. So these are very troubling times. It's very Orwellian. Orwell's prophecy has come true. 1984. First they steal the words, then they steal the meanings. And so we're faced with words like axis of evil, war against terror, simulated drowning. You have preventive war. Civilians killed are referred to as collateral damage. CIA kidnappings are referred to as extraordinary renditions. What beautiful euphemisms your America has created. Language. Language is not only power, but it provides ontological and epistemological meanings, how we come to understand our sense of being and our praxis. In writing this book, I sought that language not be informational or communicational, but to achieve a kind of action words. And I'm glad that, alhamdulillah, I was very greatly honored that just before a scholar that I really look up to on so many different facets identified that when she was writing her praise with respect to the book, which I'm very, very deeply humbled and honored by. When I speak to Muslims and I ask, how do you translate Islam into English? And almost 99.9% will give the Orientalist answer, and it will be submission. Islam does not mean submission. The word for submission actually in Arabic is khudu'. And it's suggestive of something. This is the reason that Orientalists translated it that way, because it suggests this mindless bowing down to a god, period, without kind of reflection or kind of critical thought, simply because one is of Muslim lineage, and that is about it. But the actual word for or root of Islam comes from 3 letters. Sin, Lam, Mim, Salam, to willfully deliver, based on choice, based on thought. The Quran is constantly asking, not only Muslims, but believers, mu'mineen, and I'll get to that point later. أَلَا يَتَفَكَّرُونَ أَلَا يَفْقَهُونَ. Do they not think? Do they not reflect? This is a text in which you have chapters, like the chapter of the sun, the chapter of the moon, the chapter of thunder, the chapter of the bees, the chapter of the ants. And yet Muslims cannot, for the life of them, be critical insofar as their ecosophic commitments to the land. God is stating right there, and it's right before our eyes, yet we refuse to see. Why? Because we're more interested in appealing to the civilizational narratives of the West and having what the West wants. We want the military superiority. We want the medicine. We don't want to deal with feminism. We don't want to deal with queerness in these cultural wars. Right? As if there aren't queer texts written by medieval Muslim scholars. In fact, if not sex manuals, art, and so on and so forth. But let's leave the element of sex and sexuality for now to the side. Although that's a mechanism by which the West uses and has militarized as a means of imperial conquest. At the same time, anarchism has been also mistranslated in Arabic as fawdawiyya. But as political scientist Hiba Raouf Izzat at Cairo University, who I had the opportunity to spend time with, had noted the actual word for it is la sultawiyya, without authority. So we have a crisis of meaning, a crisis of language, and that goes both ways, obviously. Then I hear terms like the Islamic State, to the point that Daesh and ISIS comes about and say we are out to establish a Dawla al-Islamiyya. Okay? Where does the word Dawla come from? What does it mean? Well, Dawla means the exact opposite of actually the state. Because Dawla stems from the verb dal, which morphically as well as semantically falls between 2. Dar, to rotate, and zal, to go away. That means it's a dynamic, ontological, epistemological meaning that's associated with this term. We didn't have a word for state. And the state is a European, Euro-colonial model of organizing societies, of governing societies, populations, disciplining, controlling them, hierarchizing them, categorizing them. So it very much represents a dehistoricized view of even our own language. Chapter 59 of the Quran, chapter of the gathering, Hajj, verse 7, for example, speaks of the Prophet's distribution of the spoils of war. Right? So that, again, it may circulate amongst the community. In other cases, like Surah Al-Imran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses this term insofar as the circulation of health. One day we have our health, one day the health fades away. So dawla means exactly the opposite of the way that Arabs, let alone Arabic speakers, let alone Muslims, have sought to appropriate it and manipulate it to establish some correspondence with that barometer of white civilization. Of course, during the pre-modern period, and this is something that the book talks about, there are several dawlas sometimes within even one dawla. And we have examples of this. The Hamdanite, the Buwayyid, the Shidi, the Ayyub, and Mamuli dawlas were within the Abyssinian period and Ummah, a term that we'll get to in a while. And the Muhammad Ali and Ali Bey Kabir's dawlas were within the Uthmanian, or during the Uthmanian period, were very much that way. And having a so-called Umayyad Caliphate did not mean that you had in Syria or Abbasid Caliphate that you had in Iraq. Again, all these are conjectures produced by colonialism and imperialism. Let me take a step back now. The book starts by calling out a certain level of hypocrisy. by wanting Muslims to be very self-reflective about what we are doing here in this moment. And I start with two incidents. I'll speak about one. Ilhan Omar, the famous Somali hijabi politician, in fact, the first hijabi Muslim that exists in the US government. In one speech, Ilhan Omar is being flanked by Angela Davis, and she starts off, this country is founded on genocide, i.e. America and Canada very much too, and mind you, it is an ongoing genocide. All the children's borns of our kin that are being unearthed, let alone the last residential schools, you have the 60s scoop, mother tongues that were ripped out, the raping, the pillaging, the theft of land is very much ongoing. The absence of clean water, and so on and so forth, the suicide rates, the imprisonment rates, you name it, an ongoing genocide. It is a settler-colonial society. But then Ilhan goes on and says, and it's founded on slavery. Actually, afterlife to slavery projects, as Saadia Hartman teaches. Standard guard laws, school-to-prison pipelines, and so on and so forth. As Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton refer to black youth as super predators, there is the Ammu Bernie that people hold as a salvation. But yeah, let's ignore the fact that he's a Zionist. Moving on. Ilhan continues on and says in the speech, and anybody could see the speech, but look at me, I'm an example of the American dream. Well, sister, it can't be both. It's either an American nightmare, as Malcolm had noted, or it's an American dream. Pick, because you can't have it both ways. This is the set of contradictions. This is a society that is founded on genocide, an ongoing one, that engages certainly in imperialism, afterlife to slavery projects, and vis-a-vis racial capitalism, vis-a-vis displacement, vis-a-vis war, vis-a-vis pillaging. It results in migrants wanting to come and to seek haven here. But at whose expense? On whose land? Who gets to sit down and have the privilege, generally, of coming here, of living, of enjoying life? This does not mean that migrants do not suffer. Again, it's not an oppression Olympics, and there are many different types of migrants. There are refugees, there are people that choose to come here, but nonetheless, the responsibility remains. You chose to be here. And I say this even to my Palestinian kin that have yet to be afforded the opportunity to go back to another settler society, their own homes, Palestine, occupied Palestine. The book then begins to take 1492 as an important historical marker. Why? It wasn't only the Colombian conquistador invasion of the Americas, and this is hardly a secular society. This is a secular Christian society. In God we trust on a $1 bill. The constitutional laws are based on a certain Protestant ethic, capitalist, racialist, understanding of property, of ownership. 500 treaties, if not more, that have been broken with indigenous people. Yet we come here, we make our oaths of allegiances that pledge our fidelity to, well, the Queen, she's gone. Now Charles. Of course, they added the Bill C-99, which includes, oh well, and the Canadian government is reconciling with Indigenous people. Well, good luck with that project of reconciliation. As Mr. Liberal Feminist Trudeau wears, I am a feminist, and marches in queer parades and feminist parades and goes and sells billions of dollars worth of weaponry to Saudi Arabia that goes and beheads queers, let alone oppresses women. Marvelous. Look at the hypocrisy. 1492 is significant because of what was going on across the Atlantic, the other side. Muslims and Jews in Andalusia, Spain, with Ferdinand and Isabel, the persecution, the murder, the death, the forced conversions. Muslims and Jews were being called as savages, as heathens, as godless, as non-human. That was part of the ongoing crusading project that is still very much continuing and passed off as a war on terror. Islam is held as a linchpin for all the evils that exist in the world today. There is no monolithic Islam, and I'm certainly not going to cover 1,443 years of history. The book deals with the contemporary, and I'm looking through the lens of social movements, because like I said, I'm an activist. I'm looking at what connects Tahrir, Black Lives Matter, No Dakota Pipeline, I Don't Know More, vis-a-vis what I just stated, a political, theological argument vis-a-vis the Quran. Of course, the Sunnah is used, the oral practice, the prophetic practice, the hadith, insofar as narrations by the Prophet ﷺ, but the Quran is my foundation. Because any Muslim, whether you're Ismaili or Ahmadi, or whether you are Sufi or Shiite or Sunni, whether you're of the nation of Islam, this is your text. Or you've chosen that this be your text. So let's deal with the parameters of this text. In the Quran, I use this methodology as is my right as a Muslim to engage in ijtihad, but a certain type of ijtihad, an anarchistic kind of ijtihad, because I'm looking. Does God want us to accept capitalism, given what I learned with regards to capitalism? Does God accept that nation states are okay, the factual reality of life, and that's okay so far as Muslim, indigenous, or native governance models? That becomes the question. And of course, throughout my discovery and what it is that I felt, spanning over 43 years from being on this earth, the answer, as far as I'm concerned, the book argues, is no, absolutely not. So I begin to use anarchistic ijtihad in the second chapter, and of course I sit down and talk about the principle of ijtihad, because it is a methodology within itself. Very complicated, what it entails, the science or ilm al-ahadith, and so on and so forth that is required. We have verses in the Quran that nobody knows the meaning of. Alif Lam Mim, Surah Al-Baqarah begins with a verse. 3 Arabic letters conjoined to form an Arabic word that nobody knows the meaning of. Not a single Arabic speaker. Part of the miracle that God was sending to Arabs, that if you think that you have commanded your own language because you are a bunch of brilliant poets, wonderful. Let me show you the extent of the limitation of your oration or understanding. Nobody understands Surah Al-Mutaqati'at. And this is part of the magnanimity. There are more blank spaces on a page than what's written in black. And anybody who's read the Quran understands that 60 to 70% does not do this and do that. It's calling on metaphors, parables, calling for reflection, calling for species, or as the verse said, وَخَلَقْنَاكُم مِّن شُعُوبٍ وَقَبَائِلَ لِكَيْ تَعَارَفُوا, and we created you from different tribes and nations, and that includes other than human life, so animals, plants, everything that exists in the world, so that we may get to know one another. وَأَحْسَنَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. The verse continues, and the best amongst you is those that exercise taqwa. Taqwa means piety, but piety in relationship to what? Social justice. Social justice. The Prophet did not come initially to sit down and point the finger, the hijab, Ramadan, do this and do that. Who would have believed? Who would have believed in Isa? Who would have believed in Moses? Who would have believed in any of the prophets and the messengers? So the establishment of social justice becomes a foundation. Okay. Well, let's look. The first thing that any Muslim is supposed to believe in, and the Prophet said over 10 years to institute this one sentence, one principle, عقيدة التوحيد. لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله. There's only one God, and Muhammad is the final and last messenger. You don't deify your family, you don't deify your tribe, you don't deify your children, you don't deify money, you don't deify any of that. The principle was set. We come here, exact the opposite. I swear that my fidelity, that if need be, I will protect and carry arms against all evil that is foreign and domestic. Liberalism has now crowned itself as God, a secular liberalism, a nation-state kind of liberalism, a crusading kind of liberalism. Joseph Mesad was very clear that part of the project of enlightenment was doing two things, and particularly even prior to that, with regards to Muslims that could not be defeated head-on vis-a-vis the Crusades. We need to racialize Islam, and African Islam, and Arab Islam, and Asian Islam, and South Asian Islam, and get them to war with one another, and we need to harp on the sectarian tendencies. A Shiite, a Sunni, and everything sectarian, and pit them against one another. Voila Iraq, voila Syria, voila Afghanistan, and many, many examples that exist. So Tawheed. Then we have a chapter called the chapter of Shura, of mutual consultation. You consult me so that I may consult you. The element of humility that I would have to go and consult somebody else, or that I want to go and consult somebody else and hence reveal the elements of my insecurity. To abandon my fear, because what I'm longing for is to establish communion, to overcome whatever internalized prejudices or fears that I have with regards to the other. You have shura. You have ijma', the concept of community consensus. You have maslaha, public welfare, and so on and so forth. Of course, I talk about the authority of the Prophet. Now we're in chapter 3. Mohamad was nothing but a messenger and a prophet that delivered that message. If you worship Muhammad, Muhammad is dead, but God is alive. حي لا يموت. What are the principles then of belief that you actually are adhering to, insofar as ethical and political commitments that inform this thing called Islam? Because just because you call yourself a Muslim, or an anarchist for that reason, or whatever else, doesn't make you a part of my community. There are Muslims that are Zionists. There are Muslims that are misogynists, that pray 5 times a day. There are patriarchal, that are abusive towards women within their household, their wives, their children, their neighbors, that don't give a damn about the earth. Or corruption within it. So just calling yourself a Muslim doesn't make you a part of my community. The same thing as an anarchist. The same thing with identifying as being Jewish. There are anti-Zionist Jews and there are Zionist Jews. So it's the ethical political commitments that inform all the identities or modern identity politics that become more relevant than the identities itself. Identities are tactical, yes. Black, indigenous, people of color suffer as a consequence of their blackness, their indigenousness, their fact that they're people of color. But they're also strategically limited, because who is black and who is indigenous? Well, you have Afro-Indigenous people, because black people contributed to indigenous extermination and indigenous people contributed to black enslavement. You have black Turkeys, black Mi'kmaq. Indigenous and black futurities are very much intertwined in this context. In the context of, say, settler-colonial Israel, you have Mizrahi, Sephardic, African, Arabs, Jews that are participating in Zionism and oppressing other black and non-black Arabs, Muslims, Christians, and so on. It's complicated. It isn't simply a matter of somebody being indigenous or somebody being black, and hence my implicit support is simply that. Particularly if our communities have also bought into barometers of cultures of whiteness, then that means that we have sellouts in all our communities. That is part of what informs also chapter 3, because I dig deep with regards to indigenous land education, which I taught at the UFT, with regards to and black geographies, let alone my investment, obviously, a third, a fifth of transatlantic or Middle Passage slaves who are Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula and west coast of Africa. How can blackness and Islam not intersect? How can this not be a part of the discussion? So, absolutely. So delving into the questions in relationship to indigenous studies, to black studies, to feminist and queer studies, and so on and so forth, becomes something that is crucial to this interdisciplinary project that I'm out to see through. Because if I'm claiming to apply Islam, I have to understand the contemporary environment in which I am seeking to supposedly apply Islam equally. Chapter 4 begins to set the stage for the non-capitalist or anti-capitalist concepts. And here I wish to distinguish between anti-capitalism and non, because I can be anti-anything. But actually going back and decolonizing in a material land-based way my own traditions, my own concepts, my own practices, spiritual, cultural, and otherwise, and beginning to project them. I'm not seeking to go back to 1492. There is no going back to 1492, and there is no going back to Muhammad's time. What I'm seeking to establish is extracting the ethical, political commitments that come with an idea. And all ideas require spirit and faith. One cannot love without spirit. Marxism, anarchism, they all involve an element of faith. And here is where I also wish to distinguish, and the book discusses, between the anthropological category of religion, the closest approximation in Arabic of which is deen, and its relationship to faith, iman, another concept that exists within the Quran, to another third concept, which is spirituality, ruhaniyya. They're all interrelated, but they're not one and the same thing. There's a difference between organized versus unorganized or disorganized religion. In Islam, there is no central authority. There's no priesthood. It's a one-to-one relationship. Anybody could issue a fatwa. Whether somebody follows on that fatwa, well, it's up to them. Going back to the anti-capitalist tenets then, I begin to look at elements such as property. Mulk in Islam functions very differently, because in Islam God owns everything, including our own bodies. Very different than capitalism. And again, we're speaking about the context of stolen land. There are other concepts like mudaraba, musharaka, Ramadan, insofar as to feel the plight of the poor, to look the homeless in the eye, to give zakah, and when you give zakah, which is the right of the poor over the rich, you don't pass it to some third authority to give it to somebody who's poor. No, you have to have that exchange, to look them in the eye, to understand the sense of homelessness and shame that comes about with poverty, the destitute. Because ultimately we're all, here's another concept that is both anti-authoritarian and certainly, or non-authoritarian and non-capitalist, khulafa. We are all caretakers of one another, vicegerents of Creator on earth, responsible for one another. All of us. So even this idea of the caliphate, that is a governing model that emerged much after the Prophet. It is not compulsory, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not lay down a macro-political structure that Muslims should govern by. But God did create and instituted, and Islam tried to do, is something else. Is to establish certain commitments on an individual and communal level vis-a-vis things like I mentioned, tawheed, shura, ijma', maslaha. Once community members begin to internalize these practices in relationship to one another, then you have a community. Why were Muslims not allowed to fight back during their oppression? And they had to leave first to Abyssinia and then after that to Medina. Because God wanted to teach Muslims how to establish community. That's the hard battle. Fighting back, that's easy. That's a tactic. It's not a strategy. What are you building? You build first and you reserve the right to self-defense. One of the last chapters that I'll talk about. But there's something that, forgive me, maybe in my exhaustion, and it's part of the understanding, and then I'll go back to the anti-capitalist thing, but I think it's something that's really relevant at this point to understand. Nation states and capitalism. Both are racial projects. Foucault identified that the nation state, all nation states are racist. And Cedric Robinson, Ruth Gilmore Wilson, Mariam Kaba, and many abolitionists have consistently argued that capitalism is a racial project. Though the nation state and capitalism may share short-term animosities, their long-term strategic interests will always be the same. That's the definition of neoliberalism. You can't separate. It's the swamp, or what Trump refers to as swamp. The swamp, the revolving door. The anti-deregulation campaigns that particularly happened in '79 with Reagan, with Thatcher, and then after that, of course, the liberals blew it wide open with NAFTA. So you can't separate the two from one another. The reason that I say this is because part of the book's argument is that the nation state is actually our real Oedipal father, and capitalism is our mother. What does the nation state teach? Like I said earlier, to hierarchize people, to judge them based on surface impressions and so on and so forth, without necessarily investing and getting to know them based on stereotypes. So we have internalized a certain authoritarian mentality vis-a-vis this daddy that disciplines, that controls. Stop at red lights, go at green lights. And follow orders, you follow laws. But there's violence that is used to reduce those laws, let alone conserve those laws, settler-colonial laws, but again, let's put that aside. But it's all part of the factoring equation. What does capitalism do? Materializes everything. Che Guevara on a t-shirt. A symbol of anti-capitalist resistance on a t-shirt. Nothing is sacred to it. Love on Valentine's Day, pride, another form, there you go. Everything is subject to commodification. Friendships, love, absolutely becomes something that's material for consumption. We've internalized these two orders. William Reich once wrote a book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism. I get really sick and tired when, maybe it's part of my frustration, when people misuse words. They keep on saying Trump is a fascist. No, Trump is not the fascist. He's seeking to become a totalitarian. He wants to be like Xi. He wants to be like Putin. He wants to, because totalitarianism is Hannah Arendt, and this is the understanding of words and their meaning, who wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism. It causes repression from above down vis-a-vis the military, vis-a-vis all kinds of forces that are going on. But fascism, once we've internalized the individualism, once we've internalized the materialism, we're constantly reproducing these asymmetries of power relationships vis-a-vis our positionalities. The state is not this abstract entity that exists over and is hovering above us. We already each govern one another every single day vis-a-vis the power relationships that exist between us. The governing order is already set. The violence is constantly reproduced. The sexism, the racism, the classisms, and so on a lateral level, on an institutional level, and certainly at the level of the macro, insofar as the nation states. So if we're on the ground and we're trying to think of a different way of changing the world, we have to reflect on the different tiers that exist. Audre Lorde long taught that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. BIPOC people need to have their own dignity and their own traditions and cultures, and to go back and actually thoroughly examine the concepts and practices that antecede modernity in what they refer to as the medieval period, to suggest a certain backwardness. To go back to chapter 4, when I talked about zakah, I mentioned Ramadan, mudaraba and musharaka, the concept of mulk. You have that forgiveness within Islam, and that cancellation. You have the forbiddance of interest, which capitalism relies on as a central pillar. Interest is charged in banks, in all sorts of economies, stretching from Cuba to China, to wherever else that you want to go on this earth. This is why I'm saying there are capitalist dimensions. Sure, there are certain more planned economies, social welfare programs, and so on, but the market is all plugged into the same spot, capitalism. You can't deal with capitalism or fantasize about demolishing capitalism without having to contend with governance, and the question of governance, the question of authority, the question of the state, and alternatives to it. And that is part of the crux that informs, again, the non-capitalist component, which cannot be read without also equally reading the non-authoritarian component side by side with it. So, the fifth chapter begins to, the same chapter, in chapter 4, I begin to dig deeper into concepts as indigeneity. I don't read indigeneity as a racial or an ethnic concept. I think it's very dangerous. Indigenous peoples is one thing, but indigeneity, which I build off folks like Janet Armstrong, Zainab Ahmadahi, Bonita Lawrence, and so on and so forth, becomes very synonymous to the concept of fitra within Islam. Because if I agree that nobody is born a Bin Laden, nobody is born a Hitler, nobody is born a Trump, nobody is born a whatever, then there's a social environment and our inclination insofar as the goodness of what fitra suggests, that we are born into this world in order to connect with the goodness within it, with that which is community, with that which represents non-human life, to associate that way. When was the I and I when I was a wee within my mother's womb? Forgive me, I ate through her, I breathed through her, and I defecated through her, everything. And then the I becomes an individualist I once it is born into this world. Chapter 5 begins to deal with the element of social movements, and particularly the concept of violence and non-violence, and the delusion of non-violence, because I don't believe that such a thing as non-violence exists. It was even the anti-black and racist and misogynist Gandhi that says, if there's violence in our hearts, then it's better to be violent than to don the cloak of non-violence to cover for impotence. But violence, again, is a tactic. Decolonization, as Fanon teaches, is an inherently violent act, because we have to go and engage in violence in the war that is already ongoing inside ourselves to understand who and what we are. How do we reconcile our so-called Canadian identity with our Muslim identity, if that's possible at all? And ironically, everybody, or at least minorities, have to identify, whether it's Asian American or whether it's Asian Canadian. Everybody has to be a hyphenated something, a Muslim American, a Muslim Canadian, an African American. Who's the one person that doesn't need to hyphenate at all? The white, because they are regarded as the native. The terra nullius land that supposedly they found empty, that they cultivated, created a heaven on earth with regards to. The manifest destiny, doctrines of discovery. Well, you have a progressive pope that won't even rescind those doctrines, those religious doctrines upon which the societies were founded. Again, so much for secularism. So I begin to look at the legacy of red and black power. Because what I'm interested in is non-statist organizing. What I want is not Black Lives Matter, what I want is the Black Panthers. Having learned from the mistakes of the Panthers. I want the free breakfast programs. I want a certain dignity, insofar as their neighborhoods, insofar as actually creating alternatives. Because that was the crisis of Tahrir. That's going to be the crisis in Iran, that was the crisis in Syria, and that's always the crisis, period. Unless you have alternatives, unless you have a revolutionary schools, hospitals, because revolutions involve very, very, very practical questions. What are you going to do with the nuclear power plant? What are you going to do with the army, the agrochemical industrial complex, the medical industrial complex, and so on and so forth? The military, this is real. So either you have a plan or alternatives or you don't. And ideally you would have at least some experimentation with alternatives in order to galvanize supposedly the masses that you wish to convert to whatever revolutionary quote-unquote idea or ideal that you wish to aspire for. That didn't exist in Tahrir and that didn't exist so far, at least certainly within the so-called Arab Spring. Black Lives Matter, I appreciate it. Direct action. What are you building as an alternative? Because you know what? There have been many George Floyds, many Sandra Blands, many Michael Browns since. But no, somehow Black Lives Matter, they just don't matter that much, at least not in this moment. And by the way, if Black Lives Matter, shouldn't Africa matter? Because there's a continent the size of East and West Europe, let alone Russia, Japan, and so on. That's how big Africa is. But somehow Africa doesn't figure into that vision of Black Lives Mattering. Well, if they matter, then they matter everywhere. So abolition has to be transnational. Decolonization has to also be transnational. It has to grasp an understanding of spirituality. It has to understand that we live in inherited violence. We're born into it, like I said. And we can't heal from that violence. And I appreciate all the, how can I phrase this without being coming off remotely as insulting? We all engage in practices on some level of care. Otherwise, we completely collapse. And I'm not the one to sit down and dictate or judge anybody for the ethics of care. But I'm sorry, there's only a limitation for the amount of healing that one can do when you don't create a different environment, let alone a community to sustain that. There's a reason why everybody should be struggling with mental health. And it shouldn't be a taboo, because we are in the midst of a crisis. Our earth is collapsing. And you know what? To assume that we have 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, what arrogance of us. Our mother is already responding. And she has her own way, her own time, and her own means. And we cannot anticipate because history isn't linear. That's again a Euro-American model, theological model of reading history. So I begin to draw red, black power, but I also look back at Islam, at the Quran. As most of you know, if not all of you, the word jihad. We all know, or should know, that jihad means literally to struggle. But there are many forms of jihad. The greater jihad is the struggle against one's own micro-fascisms, my patriarchy that I have to battle with every day. I have to learn to listen to women and not just hear them. I have to be okay with engaging my emotions as a site of intelligence as opposed to feeding into my uber machismo everything. We all have our battles. There's the smaller jihad insofar as going and engaging in self-defense, but the actual word for that is qital, to go and to fight. Not all forms of qital are jihad, and not all forms of jihad are qital. So I begin to discuss the rules of engagement and in war as a tactic in Islam, because rightfully so, you build a community, you establish your schools, your hospitals, just as the Panthers. You think you're going to be left alone? We're wards of the state. We're never going to be left alone, at least not for an extensive period of time. So we have to be able to defend these projects. As Malcolm taught, you don't stick a knife, a 9-inch knife, on my back, pull it out 6 inches and say, let's reconcile. No. The knife isn't even pulled out completely yet. The wound hasn't even healed and it's gaping. This is not a fetishization of violence. It's facing the reality of the fact that COINTELPRO legacies, in which our movements are infiltrated. The CIA was training activists within Occupy movements. There are certain realities of the world that we live in. We live in a post-Snowden surveillance age in which there's no privacy. We're digitized, we're all mined, harvested for the moment in which that data becomes relevant to condemn Mohammed as a terrorist or whatever else. So we are very much at war. And the sooner that we come to realize that, the sooner that ostensibly we can begin to transcend the false binaries, because there are false binaries. I am either, as a Muslim, condemned to either become neoconservative, fundamentalist, Daeshi, Al-Qaeda, and it's so insane that ISIS would see Al-Qaeda as too soft, and you're going to have an ISIS 3.0 and 4.0, and you won't be able to kill that idea unless you come up with a different idea. Because you live in a world in which you have manufactured or established manufacturing plants based on psychoaffective violence that people of color have internalized and wantonly reproduced. I'm not condemning ISIS, hell no. But they did tap into a dream that every Muslim wants, which is the Ummah. And the Ummah is where sovereignty lies. The Ummah is a non-territorial concept that exists within Islam. It's not bound with particular territories, and it's based, at least, on the Medina Charter that I draw inspiration from, that the Prophet established as part of the original polity, insofar as a symbiotic relationship between those who share values of social justice. The original Medina Charter included Jews, Christians, Sabians, and so on and so forth. What bound them together? Social justice principles. There are many paths to the same creator. Somebody calls creator Yahweh, somebody calls them Buddha, somebody calls them Mother Earth. No idea has a response, has an answer to everything that exists in the world. It is only by engaging with one another that we're able to build that pluriverse world together. So the chapter concludes by sitting down and discussing what I generally refer to as a biodiverse strategy of resistance. If you're talking about a revolutionary movement, you need three things, and you can't do without them. Decolonize knowledge, because you have to replace the corruptive knowledge with knowledge that is decolonial. Number two, you need to establish those alternative schools, hospitals, and number three, like I noted, you need to reserve the right to self-defend if need be. Those spaces. It's easy to think that change can happen vis-a-vis the institutions that already exist. I disagree for reasons that I've noted. You won't change the system will change you. Sooner or later. Will corrupt you. I don't recall Malcolm or Martin seeking to become professional politicians. They remained loyal to their people. They remained accountable, and yeah, they were condemned ultimately to death. But if that's the price to be paid, that's the price to be paid. Many people have paid that price before that. But we are in a dire moment, and we need to act quickly, intelligently, but also effectively, strategically. Language, power, land. Is there no alternative to academia the way that it's structured now and the hierarchies that exist within it? Because that's what institutions do. If power is fluid between us right now, I'm being afforded the privilege to sit down and speak, you're graciously all listening, you can tune out, you can walk away, you still have agency, that does not deny that, but power is fluid that way. You can interrupt, you can yell and scream. But the moment that I crystallize power within an institution, that means there's a doctrine of authoritarianism and obedience that begins to be put into play. And a new elite class will ultimately arise, even if they emerge out of a revolutionary order to dominate that society. Many well-intentioned people have tried, but instead they have become corrupt. Social change is not an easy thing, but it does require the hard work of us getting to know one another. Having that face-to-face encounter. Of more than that, developing an ethics of disagreeing, because the left doesn't have an ethics of disagreement. We tear each other apart, the Marxists, the anarchists, we're all ideologically driven. And we like to point fingers. So that's something that Islam can teach. How does one disagree ethically? And I was just telling one of my professors, Dr. Karen Dubinsky, that The first time I actually wrote a paper was in her course, insofar as that topic. And what are the ethics of hospitality? How do we offer hospitality to one another? Because again, we've all internalized stereotypes of one another. The moment that you say queer Muslims to Muslims, they're like, oh my God, haram. But did you even study what queerness is? Do you understand its relationship to gender, let alone to race? Learn, understand, know. What you fear and what is unsettling you clearly speaks to something within you that you don't clearly understand. And your responsibility becomes to educate yourself, to gain knowledge, to build insight. And it's not so easy to exercise solidarity, because we're not all alike. But that's why we need to get to know one another and we need to invest. And that can't happen while we're standing up. That means we have to establish space. That means we need to cook. We need to sit down in a comfortable, situated position to enable that kind of organizing, that kind of trust, especially if we're being infiltrated left, right, and center. So there are things to be learned by all of us. The Zapatistas have a saying that I learned very early on with them. We can't plan for revolutions, but we can certainly prepare for them. Holding each other's hands, we teach one another what each of us knows. If the sun exists over here, as I said to someone recently, and that is the truth of God, that is the truth of the sun. And I ask all of us to go to their corner and we all have pieces of paper and describe what you feel about the sun. We'll all offer truths in respect to that sun, but only in collecting those truths together will we get to an understanding or a greater understanding of the original truth. And still we may never achieve it. With that, let me just conclude and stop there and open the field for discussion and questions and answers. And thank you very much for your time and your patience and for listening.
Let you field your questions, and then we should also make sure to leave at least a few minutes near the end for people to buy books. Books are available at the back. You can even begin doing that now if you want, but we'll reserve some time at the end for that. And I think our guest is also willing to sign them if you buy them. So,
humble. It's a strange feeling, or it's a strange experience, but of course I'm very humble. It's the least that I could do. So, please.
Okay, can I ask why you use the term sellouts? Just
Can you use the term?
The term sellout for someone that's bought into white culture.
That's a good question. Look, I'll give you Malcolm's response. He was very prophetic in that way. And I really wonder what Malcolm would make of his project, particularly after coming back from Mecca, and the trajectory that he was on in a different way than he was when he was with the Nation of Islam. And forgive me for using this term. White people ascribe to me the label Sam Negro. Okay. And Malcolm defined it insofar as him seeing there being the house Negro and the field Negro. Well, how does he describe the house Negro? The house slave. Yes, sir. You sick, sir? We sick. We sick. He has no sense of his own self. He wants to assimilate. He wants to appeal to whiteness. I want to rise within society. I want to be respected within Canadian society. I want somebody to call me Dr. Mohamad Abdou. Maybe even I'll become a professional politician and be able to institute change. At whose expense? And using what barometer, what parameters, and what framework? Because we need to understand settler-colonialism is not an event. As Patrick Wolf notes, and Indigenous scholars have said continuously, it is a structure, and one that is very intelligent because it's one that evolves, that changes, that is able to accommodate fluidity within the world. So I call those sellouts those who refuse and are adamant about the fact that the path that they are on, the white supremacist path they are on, because I find liberalism to be far more dangerous and insidious, than conservatism ever was. I don't fear the KKK, I fear Obama, the drone president, the Wall Street president, that laid 26,000 bombs in his last year of office alone, who shamed black men for being absentee fathers. And this is the Messiah that a lot of people bought into. Not my Messiah, never bought into him and never will, or anybody like him. But he has a handsome face, a good set of speechwriters, and a winning smile. How can he not be a sellout? And many others like him, because they've all sold their own cultures, their own traditions, their own ways of being in the world, and refuse to actively commit to social justice, let alone see their complicity within social justice. I find it so hypocritical that Muslims, and again, I've taken part in so many direct actions. We burnt 99 police stations in Tahrir. That's not the point. It would have been more useful actually to have those police stations transformed into squats for the homeless or whatever else. Okay? But it's a cathartic moment and people are doing what they will. But I find it very saddening that Muslims would go out, take over the streets, free Palestine, even get permits from the state. Wow, we need to get permit from the state. The Women's March needs to get permit as it's surrounded by trigger-happy cops on indigenous stolen land. Free Palestine. We're Zionists on stolen land. And that's supposed to be okay? What kind of hypocrisy is this? Free Palestine? You're never going to free Palestine. From the Grand River to Jerusalem, the struggles are won. And many have written with regards to those ties. Stephen Shalaida, Dalwan Wan, Palestinians, non-Palestinians, Indigenous, and so on and so forth. So we need to face and confront the realities that we're living. And it takes courage to do so. So that's why I refer to them as sellouts. So unless that sparks something, and especially once one becomes aware, I can understand that somebody may be ignorant with regards to the example that I gave. I can explain it even further. I can provide knowledge and teaching material that others have even produced, but they continue along their path. Sorry, you're a sellout. I don't have time for you. I'll go align myself with 1,000 other people who are indigenous or black who actually get the kind of politics and the trajectory and the social justice orientation that we're after. Please.
Hi. Am I good to go?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for your speech tonight. To be honest with you, it's like you're hearing bleach in my voice. It's so painful to hear you. Because of how much I resonate with what you're saying. So my work has to do a lot more with Islamophobia education and how do we address that phenomenon. And there's a lot of pushback from the government, fellow teachers, it's awful. And you mentioned the 3 steps towards a revolutionary movement, decolonizing knowledge. And what I'm thinking, based on what I'm hearing, is how do we move from theory to praxis?
Theory is a form of liberatory praxis, as bell hooks wrote. This is why, yes, this text is political theological, it's theoretical, etc., but it's also praxis-oriented, given the so-called, again, social movement background that I'm coming from. One can only get theory is a beautiful thing, but you have to connect it materially to land. You have to connect it to movements, and social movements theory becomes nothing but a vehicle that way. You have to plug it into movements. It's like post-structuralist philosophy. It's like running around and philosophizing about the very meaning of words. And as feminists, as a lot of different discourses have mobilized that towards feminist causes, towards feminist movements, towards whatever else. But it needs to be, theory is just a vehicle that needs to be connected to something else.
I'm thinking of our education system along the lines of how it's institutionalized and how colonial it is.
Yeah.
And ultimately, we just need to blow it up and start from scratch.
You don't need to blow it up, you need to divest from it. You need to build alternatives to it. Why are we worried about blowing it up? Did blowing up 99 police stations serve everybody? No, we need to build alternatives to that.
Yes, but change is so slow.
Of course.
We're losing, people are getting distracted. And so how do we maintain focus on our goal?
It's an important question. One of the things that I would say, and again I would emphasize this point, and if we're speaking about academia, let's hold on to academia for a moment, let's hold on to this academy for a moment. Again, it's a neocolonial institution, it's hierarchical, it's all the things that supposedly are not that great. But it's a site of resistance. Because you have generations upon generations of new youth that are coming in, and we can't just abandon this space either. So we need to figure out a way, while understanding the limitations of what we're functioning within, of dealing with the system as it exists, while in the meantime investing elsewhere. So let me give a practical example. And I'm not saying this to indicate, I had the best teachers in the world, so I'm not meaning to suggest anything, right, that way. But how many books do you need to write within academia before you leave? And particularly folks that are white, why aren't you making spaces for people of color? And this isn't about representation either. But why aren't then the people that are leaving investing in land-based projects with indigenous people and building something with them that is decolonial? Because that's where the resources need to be continuously funneled. I can choose to invest in the nation state, or I can choose to divest from it. Once I start to build with indigenous people on the land, and we trust one another, and we've built, and we've organized, and so on and so forth, I don't need to go to Metro. The food comes from the land. Once we've established our free schools, and this is the idea, this is why I refer to the Panthers. Where did they get the resources from? We have a lot of initiatives that emerged out of Egypt in 2011. Of course, most of them have completely gone. We have 60,000 people, if not more, in prison, suicides, depression, death, escape, safe haven. But these initiatives came out of the will of people with very little resources. And that becomes the idea. We're very innovative beings, and I trust them. But there has to be a will for us to abandon the fear that, oh my God, if I'm not in academia, I won't get to teach anymore. Maybe they won't even call me doctor anymore. And what are we living for here exactly? For me to be called doctor? Or for us to see through a different light for our children that come from mortality and are the arrows that we shoot towards infinity, as Mohamad Abdou noted. So there has to be a long game here. And we can't keep on kicking the can down the road in a Kafkaesque endless postponement of judgment. So climate change is something that's real, and it won't care if you're an Islamist or you're a Jew or you're a Zionist or an anarchist or a Marxist. What are we then squabbling over here? And this is why, yeah, I call myself a Muslim anarchist, but the ideal Muslim is the Prophet ﷺ that I'm always seeking to aspire to, but that's an ideal. I will never attain that, and so I'm always becoming Muslim, I'm always becoming anarchist, because I'm always in a state of evolution. We're not single issue causes. I'm a set of conjunctive ends, not destructive ores. So again, it's about trying to think of ways of how can we resist within the site with the limited and finite capacity that we have, and the parameters of it, while at the same time beginning to invest somewhere else. Our energies, our resources, our getting to know, our everything. How many people have gone to research? How many people have spent time on the front lines with indigenous people, and lived, and understood, and studied? That becomes the investment. I can study business, or commerce, no disrespect, or I can engage in something that's different. That becomes the kind of investment. The government will never be interested in eradicating Islamophobia. Why would it be?
Oh, I know.
Yeah. So yeah, I just have to say, like, it's a lost cause. So we have to find other avenues. It doesn't mean we don't challenge, but there are limitations to that challenge. Maybe.
Thank you for the book. It's just so interesting and so fascinating to hear.
I just have two questions. I'm wondering first about the conception of your text in a contemporary anarchic community. You situate your work in the community that anarchy and anarchism can be spiritual in my kind of way with some kind of very secular. So I'm just wondering about how this just completely unsettles their thought and
Right.
social justice, this kind of so passionate, so pleading, right? It just seems so kind of urgent, and it seems to be directed at a particular audience in your work. I'm just wondering if it is, and if it's directed at sort of Muslim communities, does it really need to be Muslim and for it to actually even be received and for it to actually apply this really interesting thought. Do you need to kind of speak to Muslim communities in that way? For us to kind of really receive it, it needs to be, about going back to the Quran and seeing it in a different ways. I'm just wondering.
Thank you. No, thank you. Those are great questions. The first was with regard to anarchism and the reception there, and then, of course, with Muslim audiences. Yeah, of course. Since I started this many years ago, like I said, over 15, 20, even years ago, but of course there was backlash, but there's also been significant change. A lot of us, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, invested in 2011 in a book called Religious Anarchisms. And we each had more or less like a chapter within that series. That has, over the past decade, and I just recently spoke at the Anarchist Book Fair over the summer, the room was packed. Mostly, actually, people of color, which is really interesting. And I've been to a lot of anarchist spaces, and I was really, really quite impressed. And there wasn't the issue of spirituality because, as I said, and as actually an audience member noted, how can one live without spirit? The unfortunate part of anarchism, of Marxism, is that in responding to liberalism, they forgot that liberalism had left an imprint on anarchism and Marxism. Why do I say that? Because as Jackie Alexander, and Bell Hooks, Cornel West had argued, there needs to be a stepping out of the spiritual closet that secular Christianity had created. Anarchists hold the slogan, I'll tell you maybe a funny story, and that will maybe explain a little bit of the situation, at least back then and now. No gods, no masters. And I remember being at an anarchist conference in Loughborough in England, and this man, dressed in a suit, which was strange to me at the time, complete suit, white, of course, showed up to my talk, and he's sitting down and listening, and then it came time for the Q&A. And he goes about and he says, last week I made effigies, or we made effigies, this anarchist group of his, or them, of the Prophet Mohammed, of Jesus, of Moses, and we burnt them. Does that offend you? So I looked at him, and I'll never forget this situation because this just doesn't happen often, of course. And I said to him, no, I don't know what the Prophet ﷺ looked like, and Jesus, if that gives you some sort of like cathartic feeling of overcoming whatever, but I'll tell you what, I would never make effigies of Emma and Bakun and Kropotkin, who are just classical anarchist thinkers, who were predominantly Jewish, or culturally Jewish, right? He's like, well, yeah, these are our gods. Excuse me. So there is never, look, I don't care whether, and this is, if we go by the principle of the la ikrah fi din, if we go by the principle that what do Muslims lack? We have everything in comparison to indigenous people. We have our land, we have our resources, we have over 1 billion, we have our languages, we have our Quran, we haven't been exposed to the genocidal mania that is ongoing over here. Yet we are as fickle and as feeble as the foam on the waves of the ocean when it crashes into the rock. Because it's not a matter of numbers. The Panthers was not a matter of numbers. The original polity of Mohammed was not a matter of numbers. وَكَمْ مِنْ فِئَةٍ قَلِيلَةٍ غَلَبَتْ فِئَةٍ كَبِيرَةٍ. How many of a small group that is dedicated to real revolutionary change have been able to defeat a bigger enemy? So, I'm not looking to gain all anarchists, nor am I looking to gain all Muslims. That's not going to happen. I don't have that fantasy. What I do have is indigenous folks, black folks, some from here, some from there, some from here, and for us to build that pluriverse ummah together. I'm not placing my wager on anarchists. I'm not even placing my wager on anybody, really. I'm placing my wager on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. People will disappoint, movements will disappoint. Allah won't disappoint. Not insofar as hopefully when one is striving for justice. People will disappoint. Insofar as the second question, I find value, like I said, in anarchism, but I already argued that Islam is inherently anarchistic, yet I have to play this game with anarchists, with Muslim audiences, to justify the label Muslim anarchist. Am I anarchist Muslim or Muslim anarchist? Well, the moment that I utter either, when they're inside me, they're inside me. Both are in symbiosis. But the moment that the other one has to precede the other. So this is part of the dimension of it. And so far as Muslims, that's precisely why I use the Quran. Because as I always recognized, any Muslim or non-Muslim will come and tell me, show me where God says that I need to be this or need to be that, and so on. And so there's a political, theological dimension to it. There's an element of tajdeed, of ijtihad that's involved with it. And that becomes fundamental because you have to speak the language of your own communities and engage them on that level. But communities should be able to also challenge themselves in wanting to learn and wanting to educate themselves. We need to change our nouns to verbs. When we say we're coming to academia for somebody to teach us, that's different than we're here to learn, because that then assumes that we're here learning from one another. And that's different. Engaging in verb-based action becomes different. So, Muslim reception. Well, a lot of Muslims are facing an identity crisis, a Du Boisian identity crisis. Am I supposed to be a good Muslim, American, Canadian, whatever, and how am I supposed to do that? Or the other route, because of the violence that has been internalized. But a lot of Muslims are beginning to transcend, they're beginning to understand that those are false choices. Am I supposed to choose between the butcher of Damascus and a Russian, Chinese, Iran, whatever, that is aspiring to do whatever as the axis of resistance? Or am I supposed to choose a Zionist, Wahhabi, your American alliance? What kind of false choices is this? But again, this is the difference between strategy and tactic. 10 years ago, you asked me with Bashar al-Assad, the butcher of Damascus, of course, overthrow him. You ask me now and I say, please, keep him. I don't want to see Syria become another Libya. I don't want to see a Sunni, a Shia. That's the difference, a tactic and a strategy. So, again, the element of Muslims, who they are, what they are, how I speak to them, perhaps it's been promising in certain scenes, it's been not so promising in other scenes. For instance, with Muslim feminists. And I struggle with that, or at least it depends too on who these Muslim feminists are. I find that the older generation are much more obviously difficult because there's a certain crystallization of how things should be, why they should be, and so on. And it has been a struggle to get into some of these circles or to get them engaging. But eventually they will have to face what I've written. And I'm not saying this because it's me. I'm saying this because it's the argument. Because for instance, and I'll give an example, when Muslim feminists are talking about the issue of divorce and khul, and they come about and they compare, does a Muslim woman appeal to the secular Christian laws of the nation state in order to get her rights of divorce from a Muslim marriage, or does she appeal to the Muslim community, the imam, the whatever? Well, what most of the Muslim feminists are not taking into consideration is, again, the settler-colonial structure that should feed into their analysis and hence for them to be able to evaluate and perhaps transcend, again, these false binaries. So, I know I've maybe diverged a little bit from ostensibly, but it's been wide, it's been varied. It depends on what stage folks are at, but I'm going to continue to push given the hypocrisy that I see, because clearly there is a lot. So, yeah, and I expect a lot better from Muslims. We're supposed to be a shining example. Unfortunately, we aren't. Please, yes. Oh, I think that gentleman was before you, if you don't mind.
My question is about your experience writing this book and collecting your ideas over your lifetime. How have you seen any pushback within family or friends, specifically family, and how have you dealt with that sort of pushback? Because I'm really interested in seeing how you dealt with that.
My family's been incredibly loving and supportive, even if they disagreed in opinion with regard to my PhD research. It was out of a place of fear. It was out of particularly insofar as the queer stuff. We're talking also about 2013, checkpoints, curfews, all sorts of stuff going on, the targeting of certain communities, minority communities, gendered communities, and so on and so forth. So yeah, of course, there was fear from that respect, because not only of what I say, but also how I say it. And we're talking about the context of Egypt. But I'm very grateful. They could not be more supportive. I spent 10 years on the PhD, and they felt that maybe I'll never finish. But had it not been for them, I wouldn't have gone this far. So I owe it all to them, and really the communities that taught. But yeah, there's always learning to do, even within family, and family is the most difficult to contend with, because at least, again, I don't want to generalize. You can't sever a family like a jacket sleeve or an artery. You can sever a friend that betrays you, that disappoints you, that is sexist, that is racist, that is whatever. Family is a lot more difficult to do. And of course there are abusive families and so on and so forth. What's interesting, and I'll share something with you, and this is, subhanAllah, the element of just inspiration that I found in my research participants, right? Who are condemned by Muslims as being haram for what they choose to do in their private lives. A lot of my queer participants in the PhD simply said this: we don't want gay marriage, we don't want queer rights. This is all stuff that's coming from the West. We all want our privacy. We can't leave our families. We have the opportunity to flee our countries. We don't want that. What we want is social justice for everybody. And they would get harassed on the streets. Of course, men and women, because sexual harassment goes, definitely women bear the brunt of it. And non-conforming gender dissidents, of course. But men face that too. And I remember one sister telling me a story of how she was in the subway, how she was sexually harassed, and she was so angry and enraged. Of course, it's a violation. It's violence. But then later, when she's sitting down and reflecting, she's like, but how am I supposed to be? I have a right to my anger, but this person is poor, this person is uneducated, this person doesn't know their own cultures, let alone their histories, let alone their traditions, etc. So putting things into perspective that way. A politics of rahmah, a politics of compassion, but one that is also beholden to its site of social justice, that is not willing to compromise. And is not after me. I want to just be out. I want to just be this. I just want to be that. No. You have, again, siyasat al-mas'uliyah, the politics of responsibility towards your family, towards your community, towards your kin, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, family is a difficult thing to contend with. It's not easy. So, yes, please. Sorry.
First of all, thank you so much for coming here. I hope that inshallah you'll be back sometime before I graduate.
When is that? Just so that you can plan ahead?
2 years.
Inshallah, inshallah.
But I was going to ask, what can we as Muslims that are not scholars necessarily, or scholar activists or whatever, how can we help to push this kind of change within our own circles or our communities? Because if I talk to a Muslim and I'm like, actually queerness is okay, here's why, they're not going to listen. If you say to them, by the way, Islam is anarchist, they're not going to listen to a word you have to say. So how can you broach this topic with people that are a lot more entrenched in sort of a more orthodox or say Wahhabist way of understanding?
Thank you. That's a great question. Look, I think, and this would be the interesting thing, and I said it to folks, and I continue to say it, and I think they very much understand it. I don't want to start, and I refrain from starting from the issue of queerness and the issue of gender, because these are tools, but where is the structure? And what is the bigger picture that is doing the governing? Of course, race is being used, gender is being used, queerness, and these need to be on the table. But this is why I needed to go back to the original project prior to working on the project that I did after, which is the PhD, before I published that one. Of course, I need to hopefully be in a tenure-track job, but that's a different story. And we need to put things in their proper order, and not to deny that queerness shouldn't be there at the center and as an axis. But if I'm to take, and this is why I focused on capitalism and the nation state, these are the governing orders that exist in the entire world. I'm not going to start with the hijab. Again, the same way that the Prophet did not start with the hijab. The Prophet looked at the big picture. There's injustice. How do I stop Umar from engaging in femicide? Umar who wanted to kill me, Umar who hated Islam, and subhanAllah, who became a Muslim, and is sitting down in a gathering, and one moment he's laughing ecstatically, and the next moment he's weeping. And they ask Umar, why are you laughing? Why are you crying? I'm laughing because I remember one day I had a god made of dates. And I got hungry, so I ate the god. Why are you crying? Because I remember burying my own daughter because I was so ashamed as an Arab to have a daughter because we privileged men. That's the revolutionary transformation. That's the commitment. Revolutions involve you change the way that you eat, the way that you sleep, the way that you engage in intimacy, any assumption that you might have about yourself. And it's challenging and it's scary and it's hard. But if you're colonized, what choice do you have towards seeking the truth? Unless you want to be sheep and follow the rest of the sheep or become a wolf. The other suggestion that I would have is that if certain Muslims are not invested in the kind of interests that you or others have, align yourself and organize with those who would share your principles. Folks at Four Directions, folks at Tandanega, Indigenous organizers on campus, student organizations, black student organizations. Because we have to understand that religion is inseparable from politics, just as race is inseparable from religion for the reasons that I stated at the beginning. They were inherently politicized. Somebody who doesn't want to recognize that wants to closet religion within the private sphere, as a lot of Muslims do, let's just toe the line. Maybe the investment is worthy elsewhere, with people in which you can actually build the pluriverse world differently. Please, ma'am.
Hello, Mohamed.
Assalamu alaikum. It's good to see you, ma'am.
So I have a question related to kind of the transnational elements that you touched on earlier. How do we kind of go about or like imagine a kind of transnational anarchist / non-authoritarian transformative politics that focuses on this interpersonalness that that we've been talking about today?
You know the famous saying, I mean, Gustavo Esteva, a lot of people, a lot of scholars, a lot of activists have said this. Think globally, act locally. One has to, I'm looking at Iran, and I was in Montreal yesterday, and the sister that helped organize the event, Jazakallah khair, from the gender advocacy, she's Iranian Kurdish, she's telling me her life story. Of course, emotions are running high. We're talking about Egypt, differences, similarities. We have to situate things in context. What's going on in Iran? Does a woman have a right to go and burn and take off the hijab? A woman can do whatever it is that she wants. And nobody can dictate and should dictate or be allowed to dictate to a woman what she does, let alone to other human beings. Morality police. There's a gendered Islamophobia element because of the way that the optics, insofar as the West seizes on this as an opportunity. The sister tells me, but these are Kurdish and some of them are anarchist and communist. But what are their what is their end game? Is it to take over the states? Or is their end game something else? Are they going to condemn Islam and engage in some Ataturkian privatization, secularization of Islam? Or is it going to be something that's radically different, that's going to appreciate spirituality, and I don't care whether you're a Buddhist or you're a Hindu or whatever else. So that becomes the impulse. What is going on in Iran? Iran is happening in a context, and this is not to take away from the women or the movements on the ground. It's to contextualize the bigger picture. What's the bigger picture? You have a nuclear deal that's being negotiated that is never going to happen. You have an asymmetric war that is going on between Iran and Israel because of an existential values that supposedly each have in opposition to one another. So we need to bear these things into context, particularly social movements. It's very difficult to do it in the heat and the moment, and I go back now to Tahrir. Millions of people in the square, we had our neighborhood councils, women were manning checkpoints, the breaking down of gender relations, men bringing food to Tahrir. the Nasrite next to the Sadatist, next to the Islamist, next to the chain-smoking hijabi, next to the liberal, next to the anarchist tent, let alone anarchists who marched in a pride parade in Tahrir, or queer people that marched in a pride parade in Tahrir. Most Egyptians don't even know that, but it happened. But what united them was this idea of wataniyya, which I talk about, al-qawmiyya. This nationalist, and let me remove this dictator, let me remove this regicide. Is there not a mini Mubarak, a mini Trump, a mini Obama that exists inside each of us? There is. And Egyptians were scrubbing the floor. Of course, the first time you feel it's your land, you're responsible. But then what do you do after 18 days? Call in the army, because you as a people didn't figure your stuff out. You did not think through what are you and how are you going to live tomorrow. So it's these moments that I fear the most, and this is why alternatives, whatever it is that we can build, because it is all collapsing. The entire system is falling apart. It's not just climate change, and we're simply band-aiding. A house is crumbling, and we're plastering the cracks in the wall. It's not much of a solution. So that coordination, that building of trust, it's also very difficult to do virtually, because you don't know. And virtually, a lot of asymmetries of power are reproduced as well. And we know that because of many people that have, obviously documented this. I document this. The Constantine documents it in the context of Palestinians or queer Palestinians that go online to find connections because they feel ostracized within their own communities and societies. So they're longing for that sense of community, and we're so desperate for community. But what do we do when we don't have community? We become monsters because we want more power. We want to feel important. We want to feel satisfied. We want to feel that our voices matter. And if community doesn't give me enough power, I'm going to take that power. But if I do feel satisfied, if I do feel that my community appreciates me, values me, I won't have that hunger to just covet power all the time. I will learn to share, and the beauty of sharing. So the days of course, it was never a Twitter or Facebook revolution. That's important, obviously, to realize with regards to Tahrir, but the jig is up insofar as Twitter being some kind of organizing tool. That's just armchair activism. Everybody on Twitter now, or a lot of people, again, so that I'm not being hyperbolic, everybody's like, intersectional, decolonial, I'm on this land, on that land. But what have you done on the ground? What movements have you been a part of? It's become this woke everything. And you can't trust that. And you follow people, and people develop 600, 700,000 followers. Essentially an entire army. But, of course, because you're not really woke, because you're not really intersectional, because you're not really interdisciplinary, you just preach. And we know it all the time from departments at universities that claim interdisciplinarity, but aren't really interdisciplinary at all. They want the orthodox, the classical, the everything. So yeah, yes. Like on the
Have some further discussion individually, but we should have some time to buy and sign books. But before we just, call the official end of collective proceedings, Mohammed will be here signing